Our government. Emphasis on our. Government is merely a servant, merely a temporary servant. It cannot be its prerogative to determine what is right and what is wrong, and decide who is a patriot and who isn't. Its function is to obey orders, not originate them. Mark Twain, celebrated author, humorist, entrepreneur, and lecturer. What went wrong and what went right? If America was ever at a crossroads, that time is now. We, the American people, are the only ones that can steer this country in the right direction. Can we put our ideology and party loyalty aside long enough to raise our unified voices and let it be known that America is ready for a new era of progress, one that recognizes all citizens equally? This chapter is not so much a narrative in the truest sense, but highlights some points that not everyone may be familiar with. Read on. If there is a continuing theme in this book, we, the people, are the government. Those we elect to run the government are our employees paid with our tax dollars. Individuals running for public office deserve our respect since we ask them to audition for a job by raising huge sums of money to conduct a public campaign for up to a year. Once elected, they become willing employees rewarded with an income of $174,000 per year, plus a benefits package most Americans will never achieve. The dilemma we face is that once we elect them, we move on from our busy lives as if we have no further responsibility. A let George do it mentality takes over. That leads to problems as these employees assume more and more control over our lives because we've abdicated our oversight responsibilities. Some wrongfully believe that solving problems with these employees means taking matters into their own hands. On March 4th, 2020, 49-year-old Guy Wesley Reffitt was the first to stand trial for charges in connection with the January 6th breach of the Capitol. It took the jury just 2 hours to find Mr. Reffitt guilty on 5 charges. Mr. Reffitt told his family and others that he was fed up with career politicians and a corrupt Congress. He was going to Washington to damn well do something about it. If they won't follow the laws of the land, we have no reason to follow their laws. Time to remove them, Reffitt said. He believed under constitutionalist doctrine, citizens had the authority to disobey any laws they disagreed with. Whoa! If that were the case, America would be a lawless society. Mr. Reffitt and the others who invaded the Capitol to solve the problem failed to question why the President of the United States took an oath to defend and protect the country, was party to an illegal scam to keep himself in office. Millions of Americans will agree with Mr. Reffitt on one point. The U.S. Congress requires reform. And yes, too many members of Congress are there too long. On these points, Mr. Reffitt has our attention. But where he goes off the rails is his solution on how to fix the problem. Those who committed violent acts on January 6 fail to comprehend how these things are handled in a democracy. First, they are not their laws, they are our laws. Second, the Constitution calls for the people to participate in free and fair elections, not an armed revolt to overturn the legitimately confirmed election results. Reffitt and his fellow mob members decided that none of that applied to them and proceeded to take matters into their own hands, injuring many Capitol Police and causing some to die. The mob was guilty of not discharging their responsibility as citizens in a civil, passive way. Instead, they listened to the wolves in sheep's clothing. Latet Angus and Erba, Roman for snakes in the grass, who repeatedly lied to them. The invaders had been duped and were on a false mission. The best government is that which teaches us to govern ourselves. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, German poet, playwright, novelist, scientist, statesman, theater director, and critic. In a Quinnipiac University poll, a majority of Americans, 58 to 37%, think that democracy is in danger of collapsing. Just over half of Americans, 43%, expect political divisions in the country to worsen over their lifetime. 28% expect them to remain about the same, and 15% expect them to ease up. Polls provide a snapshot, but they do not solve problems. People do. As pointed out in a Quinnipiac article, fear of the enemy within, not a foreign threat, punctuates a grim assessment by Americans who believe democracy is in peril caused by a deepening political division. Who's at fault? First, let us agree that it is not my country, it is not your country, it is our country. This is not the American Revolution of 1861. Between then and now, we were supposed to get smarter. Some have allowed ourselves to fall prey to misleading, deceitful factions who sent them to do their dirty work on January 6th. To read the Quinnipiac poll, Google Quinnipiac National Poll finds nearly 6 to 10 think nation's democracy is in danger of collapse. Let us not seek the Republican answer or the Democratic answer, but the right answer. Let us not seek to fix the blame for the past. Let us accept our own responsibility for the future. John F. Kennedy, 35th President of the United States. In his book, Last Best Hope, America in Crisis and Renewal, author George Packer minced no words when he made the critical point that citizens have failed to hold up their end of democracy's bargain. Self-government is democracy in action, not just rights, laws, and institutions, but what free people do together, the habits and skills that enable us to run our affairs. Packer writes, Tocqueville describes self-government as an art that needs to be learned. It's what Americans no longer know how to do, or even want to do together. It's hard work, for it needs not just ballots and newspapers and official documents, which we still have, but also trust, which we've lost. It depends on our ability to argue, persuade, and compromise to achieve things for the common good, like the suppression of a catastrophic pandemic. It requires you to imagine the experience of others, to recognize their autonomy, and yet to think for yourselves. From the book, Last Best Hope, America in Crisis and Renewal, by George Packer, journalist, novelist, and playwright. Available. Tocqueville was a French aristocrat, diplomat, political scientist, and philosopher and historian. Government is instituted for the common good, for the protection, safety, and prosperity and happiness of the people, and not for profit, honor, or private interests of any man, family, or class of men. John Adams, American statesman, founding father, and second president of the United States. To have to deliver this message, but there's no blaming anyone else for our problems but ourselves. As wealthy and privileged as any man, Henry Ford reminded us of what can never be overstressed. The government is a servant and never should be anything but a servant. The moment the people become adjuncts to government, then the laws of retribution begin to work, for such a relation is unnatural, immoral, and inhuman. Mr. Ford's words resonate like ricocheting echoes off the Grand Canyon wall. For the citizens of a democratic nation to sit back and not take personal responsibility, to hold those elected to their oath and office as a criminal act perishable by fill in the rest. In the preamble of the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson wisely wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that their Creator endowed them with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights, government is instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness." The key wording is to abolish it. not by an armed and unruly mob invading the United States Capitol, but to exercise our responsibility in the voting booth, like informed adults, where we choose who gets to represent us and who doesn't. If there are problems with anyone we choose, we need only to look inward and question why we repeatedly re-elect some of them, yet expect different results. The will of the people shares the basis of the authority of government. This will shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage, and shall be held by secret vote or by equivalent free voting procedures. The Carter Center. Election standards. One disturbing problem is that we choose candidates based on party affiliation, ideology, or religious beliefs because they think and believe like us. That is selfish and self-defeating and leaves us all vulnerable. Elected officials are not there to mirror us, but to manage the government for us. The only common sense way to judge candidates for public officials is by their character, integrity, morals, and qualifications to do the job we ask of them. Common sense rules. I hate all politics. I don't like either political party. One should not belong to them. One should be an individual standing in the middle. Anyone who belongs to a party stops thinking. Ray Bradbury, one of the most celebrated 20th century American writers of fantasy, science fiction, horror, mystery, and realistic fiction. Ask 10 people if political parties are affiliated with a government, and 6 out of 10 will say they are or they aren't really sure. So much for civics class. Unfortunately, there are no mandatory federal standards for teaching civics or social studies anymore. Instead, each state has its standards, and it reflects its priority and history. In many school districts, civics is conducted only once, often in a semester-long high school class. There's our problem. We fail to educate our children about how democracy is supposed to work and the role they will play in upholding it as adults. For the record, political parties are not affiliated with the government. They're private entities that have morphed into big corporations over these many years to maintain control over their product. Spoiler alert, we the people are their product. In the Soviet Union, capitalism triumphed over communism. In this country, capitalism triumphed over democracy. Fran Lebowitz, American author and public speaker, known for her biting social commentary on American life. Now we come to that dirty little secret, capitalism. It supports, controls, and influences politics and politicians, and, in turn, the decisions politicians make on behalf of their benefactors, corporate America. Capitalism is supposed to work for anyone willing to work hard and succeed, but that is a lie because it doesn't. To expect our elected officials, who benefit directly from corporate America, to correct course is akin to putting our children in charge of the cookie jar. We have the best government that money can buy. Mark Twain, American writer, humorist, entrepreneur, publisher, and lecturer. We can either have democracy in this country, or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of very few. But we can't have both. Louis Brandeis, Associate Supreme Court Justice. Plutocracy is a government controlled exclusively by the wealthy, either directly or indirectly. A plutocracy allows the wealthy to rule, either openly or by circumstances, resulting in policy exclusively designed to assist the wealthy, which is reflected in its names. The Greek words plautos and kratos translate to wealthy and powerful or ruling, respectively, in English. Source: Investopedia. Google, what is a plutocracy? In her newsletter, Letters from an American, historian Heather Cox Richardson wrote, in the 1850s, 1890s, and 1920s, and then again in the modern era, wealthy people have come around to the idea that society works best if a few wealthy men ran everything, in the 1890s, 1920s, and 2000s, they had gotten there the same way. First, a popular movement had demanded that the government protect equality of opportunity and equal justice before the law for those who had previously not had either, and that had popular pressure had significantly expanded rights. Then, in reaction, wealthy Americans began to argue that the expansion of rights threatened to take away their liberties to run their enterprises as they wished. To tamp down on the expansion of rights, they played on racism of poor white male voters who controlled the government, telling them that legislation to protect equal rights was a plan to turn the government over to black or brown Americans or immigrants from Southern Europe or Asia who would use their voting power to redistribute wealth. The idea that poor men of color voting meant socialism resonated with white voters who turned against the government's protecting equal rights and instead supported a government that favored men of property. As wealth moved upward, popular culture championed economic leaders as true heroes, and lawmakers suppressing voting in order to redeem American society from socialists who wanted to redistribute wealth. Capital moved upward until a very few people controlled most of it, and then, usually after an economic crash, made ordinary Americans turn against the system that favored the wealthy. The cycle began again. Heather Cox Richardson is an American historian and a professor of history at Boston College. To subscribe to our newsletter, Google Letters from an American. In Democracy of Dollars, attorney and author Richard O. Jacobs wrote, "What many have yet to understand. As a society, we have morphed from a democracy of people into a democracy of dollars. Consequently, the two political branches of our federal government, the legislative and executive branches, designed to protect and serve all Americans, have become willing resources to special interests who, in today's pricey politics, can buy their way to the head of the line." Richard O. Jacobs is an attorney, author, and environmentalist. Democracy of Dollars is available on Amazon.com. Brookings Institute scholar Darrell M. West echoes Mr. Jacobs' sentiments when commenting on the new information magnets. The issue is we are now very dependent on the personal whims of rich people, and there are very few checks and balances on them. They could lead us to a liberal, conservative, or libertarian direction, and there is very little we can do about them. It simply comes down to this. If special interests can buy their way to the head of the line, where does that leave us? Money begets power, and as money and power goes, so goes the country. Forbes reports that American billionaires' financial influence in politics has increased dramatically in the past few campaign cycles. This small, influential group of America's wealthiest now account for nearly 10% of all federal campaign spending, a number that was below 1% before the 2010 Supreme Court decision of Citizens United versus Federal Elections Commissions struck down spending limits for corporations and labor unions, opening the floodgates for significant outside spending in federal elections. Billionaire campaign spending reached a high in 2016, according to the report from the Institute for Policy Studies and a liberal group, Americans for Tax Fairness, contributing over $684 million, more than 41% higher than the $16.6 million billionaires collectively given in the 2008 election. The report placed the blame squarely on the 2010 Citizens United Supreme Court decision, which allowed for the creation of super PACs and political action committees that operate outside of standard campaigns and without spending limits, as a direct reason for the increase in billionaire spending. The Supreme Court came down on the side of money, not people. Make of that what you will. To read the report, Google billionaires spend 41 times more on 2016 elections compared to 2008. There may be some hope on the horizon. Congressman Adam Schiff of California has introduced a constitutional amendment to overturn the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision and allow for reasonable restrictions on corporate campaign contributions and other spending. We'll see how that goes and how soon, if at all. It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their own selfish purposes. Andrew Jackson, 7th President of the United States. Many good and honorable men and women who get elected to Congress go to Washington with the best of intentions. Once there, the Washington two-step system kicks in, and they are often obligated to vote party line, not their conscience. Second, they're required to spend an excessive amount of time each week fundraising for their next election in the party's general fund. They may lose out on plum committee assignments if they don't play by the rules. The system voids an individual's ethics and morality, ensuring those who have neither remain in control. One of the penalties for refusing to participate in politics is that you end up being governed by your inferiors. Plato. His birth and death occurred in Athens, Greece. Founded the Platonist School of Thought and Academy, the first institution of higher learning in the Western world. A Pew Research Center report indicates that 64% of adults, nearly 2/3, say they question whether what they hear from elected officials is true and what is not. 16% admit that finding the truth on social media is a challenge, 41% the same amount on cable news outlets, and 69% say it is easier to determine the truth when talking with people they know. But even that is challenged by 30% who remain unsure of what they hear when speaking to people they know. Reread the Conspiracy and Misinformation chapter. To read the Pew Research Center report, Google Americans Struggle with Truth, Accuracy, and Accountability. By its very nature, the government is obligated to reform itself from time to time to reflect our changing society. Who gets to initiate that reform? Why, it's Congress, of course. However, be assured they will first consider how any reform will affect the status quo that keeps theirs, big business, and the power brokers' engine running. And that's no